All right, thank you, Neil. So just some suggested conversation topics, and these are not meant to be in order or required, but just to sort of frame some of the conversation we're hoping to have with people. Are you in a setting that utilizes a multidisciplinary team? Who's on it and why? What's been your experience working with a multidisciplinary team? And if you could make a change or develop sort of the ideal multidisciplinary team, what might your team look like? How do you handle things like confidentiality and information sharing in that kind of a setting? And how do you work cross-professionally with people who, again, are coming at some of these issues raised by working with people in this space who may be at risk or have committed violent acts? How do you work with folks coming at this from different perspectives? How does the age of the person that you are wrapping services around and intervening with, how does developmental issues and age of client impact the work of the multidisciplinary team? And again, just following up on some comments earlier, what role does law enforcement play in your multidisciplinary teams? And what's been your experience working with law enforcement? I know one of our keynote people talked about the HIPAA exclusion, and that there is that allowance for sharing information with law enforcement. But again, in my work in this area, I know that I'm speaking primarily as a social worker. There can be some reticence or confusions around what can and cannot be shared with law enforcement, under what circumstances, what can be shared. So even with the understanding that there's a HIPAA allowance there, that doesn't necessarily make it crystal clear to the multiple professionals in these kind of team settings. And then the importance of documentation. How do you document the work of your team, and how do you manage, and what are some of the standards of practice? So again, these weren't meant to be exclusive or required conversations, but we wanted to just give people a chance to sort of think through some of those things. Nicole, anything you want to add about these questions, or just sort of framing the conversation?
I'm just going to come at it from the kind of the K-12 perspective. So we did talk a little bit about, and you mentioned this, about the age of the person. If you're talking about an elementary school student, there's going to be a very different discipline, approach to how you interview and speak with that student. Documentation, I think, is important, as well as the confidentiality piece. And coming from a school counselor perspective, we are taught that you don't share information unless a student is about to harm themselves or planning to hurt someone else. There are certain requirements that have to be met before you break that confidentiality. And so to have to include law enforcement in that, knowing that that student might be on the verge of, potentially being charged with something. Your goal is to try and prevent those things from happening and keep the students safe. But I think those are all conversations we need to have, coming from my perspective. At the school level, my job is to protect those students. And even if that means, trying to keep the law enforcement away from them, when I have to be aware that law enforcement is going to have to be involved, even if it's for situational awareness sort of thing. And then thinking about how, we already work with confidentiality as far as like IEPs go, for instance, for K-12 people. Not everyone has access to a student's IEP. So that documentation, not everyone is going to have access to those documentation items when it's coming towards a threat assessment. So as Jim said, we do not want to sit here and talk back and forth to each other at all. We would like to engage you guys in these conversations, to talk about what is happening in your situations. So we can start with any question. If anybody has something they want to bring up, I think that the keynote was a great lead in to this conversation. I felt like we could have just kept going from what they were talking about. And so I think we just want to dive in and talk about what you're seeing, what you're experiencing, and what your roles have been, and how we can have this conversation and improve everyone's practice.
I'm gonna, if it's okay with people, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen just so I have a better chance to see everybody on the camera. I can pull it back up if necessary. And then I guess the only other thing I would like to just preface the conversation with is on the website for the practitioners network are a number of documents that have been developed for the various webinars the network has done. And one of the documents on there is related to behavioral assessment and management. And on that document is some good information about some best practices related to multidisciplinary teams. So if you need a good document as a follow-up to this facilitated conversation, I would encourage you to go to the PPN website and look for the document on behavioral assessment and management, just so you can have a takeaway with some key stuff about multidisciplinary teams. So why don't we Nicole and I can stop there, and we can address some of the questions that come up in the chat, as well as just if you want to unmute yourself, go on camera, not go on camera, whatever you're comfortable with. But we invite some conversation about the whole idea of multidisciplinary teams, your experiences, and what's gone well, what could go better, and how you manage some of the tensions within that kind of a framework.
This is the audience participation element of this conference, so please don't be shy.
We don't have anything in the chat right now, so if anybody, wants to unmute themselves and just talk, we don't require you have your camera on, so please. I saw Greg turned his camera on. I don't know if that means he wants to say something or not, so that would be great.
Yeah, I don't care for a whole lot of dead space, so I'll jump right in.
Thank you.
I'll try to give you the real short version. By nature of the organization and by nature of the program, we know we can't do it. We got to have working disciplinary teams. And we know when we create teams, we got to let them go through the forming, norming, storming process. So we have some structure around that. But when it doesn't work, it's often miscommunication or leadership. So we often ask, who's the lead and who's the co-lead? We don't want the leader not be able to attend the meeting and nothing happens. Hey, that's the co-lead's responsibility. But throughout the structure of the UWASI program, from the governing body down to the specialty team, there's a lot of accountability. There's a lot of accountability. We sit around the table and go round robin and say, are you okay, Atlanta Fire? Are you okay, Atlanta Police? Are you okay, Atlanta EMA? And speak now or forever hold your peace. The organization essentially is a convener. So 39 members from throughout the metropolitan Atlanta area, many of which are elected officials, they come to the room designed to take off their city of Atlanta hat and work on this regional project. Water is not Atlanta, water is the region. Homeland Security is not Cobb County. That's one of the neighboring jurisdictions. Homeland Security is regional. With kind of more honed on this space, we made it clear that when it comes to sharing assets or acquiring assets, that the jurisdictional members need to be at the table. I mean, sometimes we would structure it, we have enough money for 3 and it's 7 of y'all. Who's first, who's second? How do we phase it? We are putting out a bid for X, Y, and Z. You approve of the specifications or design the specifications. So they have some what we call sweat equity in it. Now moving over to the kind of non-asset distribution, if you will, we made it very clear. When it comes to planning, the subject matter expert is who we want in the room. We don't care if they're a member of the footprint or not. Let's go get the best. The old adage is someone asked a question and everybody looks to the person, not the leader, looks to this person to want to know what the answer is. We want that person. If the subject matter expert in the region, across the region, outside the region, we want them in the room when it comes to planning. When it speaks to training, we would get participation and get folks to work together by saying, we're going to allot so many slots. And if you want to share some of your slots with a jurisdiction within your footprint, then you can. So we give Atlanta 10 slots and they only have enough bandwidth to have 5 of them, then they can share it with their joint adjacent jurisdictions, but they can't go 2 counties over and give that slot. And then I'm going to drill down just a little bit more and really close this. When we did that program, obviously someone said there's a show the consequences. There was an incident, and government's reactive. There was an incident that thrust that into being. So we went and spoke with the leadership of those faith institutions and said, under what scenario will you participate in this conversation? But we reached out to other leaders who already knew them. We didn't go cold. We basically went and leveraged the relationship that was already there. And you got to do that. You got to, and that's kind of managed relationship 101. Go with a friend who knows the friend that gives you the warm transfer, if you will. And establishing some groups like the one, we call them working groups. So there are working groups that are created that it simply may be an initiative. Less than a year, we need these folks to come together, and then they disband. That project's done. But on this combating domestic violent extremism, we already had those working groups and relationships with faith communities. We went to our JTTF members and say, we're going to do something different. Not just tell us what you need, help drive this thing. So now you got faith community members in the same room with JTTF members. And so the bottom line, in many of these jurisdictions, there are people that's just what they are. That's just what they do. A person might be the assistant fire captain, but he is also the thyroid expert. Well, we want you on the thyroid work group. That's not your role and responsibility now, but you're the key member that will help move this project along. I'm trying to think of a scenario where it didn't work and it blew up in our face, and I can't think of one.
That's good.
It didn't work as family. I mean, you had to keep pulling and pushing, and sometimes put them on the spot and say, y'all are the quietest bunch of such and such and such and such.
Well, I wanted to go back, and I know we had a hand up a second ago, and we do have I see a question in the chat we can raise in a second, but just a couple of takeaways from what you just said. I mean, I think, a couple of key phrases I heard. One was leveraging existing relationships. And for those organizations or practitioners looking at, how do you develop a multidisciplinary team, even if it's not necessarily agency based, but you're looking at a more kind of community level, bringing people together, leveraging existing relationships, thinking about your networks, current networks. How can you use some of those connections to build interest and to build motivation to get involved with this work? The other phrase that you used were sort of subject matter experts, and bringing subject matter experts to the table. And within multidisciplinary teams, subject matter experts can run the gamut of what those teams may need subject matter experts in. But that's a good phrase, I think, to think about the people that you want around the table, those that can help with different aspects of management, assessment, intervention, etc. And again, some of that might be leveraging existing relationships, but some of it may be looking at your community, looking at your other networks, and trying to identify people that could serve that role as subject matter experts as you're building your team or building your infrastructure to address the needs that these clients bring up. Before we get to comment in the chat. I'm wondering, someone had their hand up a second ago.
It was Rick, I believe, I saw up for a little while.
Okay, I didn't know if Rick wanted to jump back in and comment, or.
I can. I just wanted to just pose a question.
Sure.
And I've posed it to different groups and meetings that I've been involved in. When we talk about the roles of threat assessment teams in Florida, we have statutory requirements for threat assessment teams in schools, and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement has delved into a big initiative on targeted violence prevention. But I think one of the missing gaps, one of the holes in it is that, like in our case in schools, what happens when these students time out with us? And we used, the Parkland case as an example. He was no longer a current student, but he was not on anyone's radar at that point. I think we're starting to address that a little bit here, but I was just interested to see what, if any, other areas and how they deal with that.
Maybe we can see if any of the people on the call, on the meeting, want to jump in here and share their perspective about what happens when someone sort of ages out or exits a school setting or some other setting, and how do you keep those people on your radar? Have you found a good way to keep people on the radar who need ongoing attention?
I could say I think that's a really important question. I don't know that anyone's got the answer. I think one of the things that we're trying to do in Massachusetts is we have Mass Bay Threat Assessment Team, which is a regional community-based threat assessment team. And Sarah Wielden, who's the coordinator of that team, is working really hard to build bridges with schools and their threat assessment efforts, because really, I think, we need to be thinking not just what about when a kid ages out, but what happens at 3 o'clock when the bell rings. There's really a community intersection with every institution, and every institution is sort of bounded in a way where they can't know the whole of it or speak to some of the things that happen kind of beyond their purview. So I think it's an important model to kind of push forward, is how can we coordinate institutional threat assessment teams with more community-based threat assessment teams, so that there's a bit more of an umbrella that holds people as they move through communities.
That's a good lead in, Heidi. There's been a couple of things in the chat, and I just want to go back to if David Clement is comfortable joining us into the conversation, because you had posted a question to me about sort of community-based teams and some of the unique issues with that. And then I see your comment saying community interventions are key here. If you're comfortable unmuting and want to jump in and just share your experience trying to do this teamwork at a community level, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, sure, I can try. So thank you very much, James. So right now I work for the Canadian government, so I'm not anymore a community practitioner, but in my previous roles, I worked for a couple of years in community practice as a social worker, I used to manage a community center, and so in that center we had social workers. But of course, as a community worker, we were constantly engaging with other sort of sectors, folks coming to our center, offering services in our center, including law enforcement. And there were instances where, and we talk about role definition and role expectations as well. Well, we saw that sometimes law enforcement officers were thinking they would need to counsel our youth at risk, and then we became anxious because counseling and providing that level of support is not, in my view, part of that role that law enforcement plays here. In other instances, we had midnight soccer events where we tried to engage with youth at risk from every Friday from 10 p.m. until 2 a.m. in the morning, and that was a way to engage with youth that are street involved and so on. And we again had services come to these events to offer services, very low key have conversations, and again, also law enforcement. And many of the youth had issues with law enforcement, so it made many youth uncomfortable that for some reason police shows up at a venue where we used to play soccer, have fun, and have meaningful conversations in one-on-one or group settings. So I took this back. I was also managing a situation table with law enforcement as well for 5 years, and we talked about roles and responsibilities and how our different sectors work on situation table, but that does not mean that these roles then play out into different settings, such as a midnight soccer setting or showing up and providing quote unquote counseling to youth at risk in the community centers. These were some of my experiences. It can really differ if you're sitting at a situation table with clear roles and responsibilities, including law enforcement, community outreach, mental health services, as well as other settings such as midnight soccer, for example.
No, that's a good point. And certainly at the community level, trying to think about, the presence or the presence of law enforcement, their role, understanding what, again, they might think their role is versus what the community partners might think their role is or should not be. And that might be a good lead in. We've had Sammy in the chat talking about the role or importance of communication with law enforcement. And I like the phrase that you used, which is law enforcement may not be able to unhear information that has been shared, whether the people sharing it understood that parameter for law enforcement. And I saw your follow-up, Nicole, about drawing those boundaries. I'm wondering if for those of you in this meeting that have engaged with law enforcement or worked with law enforcement, or if we have people from law enforcement in this meeting who have participated in some of these multidisciplinary spaces, I'm wondering if people might want to jump in and share some of their perspectives on what that work is like, sharing information, collaborating with law enforcement, and law enforcement collaborating with the service providers, if people would like to jump in and just share some of their experiences with that.
Hi, I'm Mackenzie from a school district in Tennessee, and I serve as the district threat assessment, and we work very closely with our SROs. We have 10 schools across the district, and we've got an SRO or multiple in each of one of those schools. And so a big part of implementing our threat assessment process was first training our SROs and exactly what our processes would look like, and helping them understand that we wanted them to be a part of our teams, and that our job was not to replace anything related to law enforcement, but more so to really partner together to get the best and safest outcomes for all. And so I think that was a huge piece of starting our collaboration, was them understanding the threat assessment process, not as a replacement for law enforcement, but more as a partnership. And so that took away kind of a lot of the questions. And I think a large piece is too, if we see a student bring a weapon to school or something, obviously law enforcement is the first to respond there. We've got to secure the safety of the school, but it's been a information sharing piece that our schools still aren't safe if that individual returns to school. Even if they have, 180-day suspension, we've still got a student that poses a threat to our campus. And so that mutual understanding that a threat assessment needs to occur in collaboration with law enforcement interaction is really essential. And so I think a lot of it is just communication is so essential in working with our law enforcement partners.
I think that's really important too to think about, because like you said, you suspend a kid for 180 days. There needs to be some supports. If they're coming back, there needs to be some supports, and they need to have had some sort of counseling situation happening before they return, so that they are, because again, like they said this morning, removing a student does not remove the threat. They can still walk into that school at any point. So I think that's a really good point to bring up, that the exclusionary practices not only don't work, but they can actually exacerbate the situation. So thanks, Mackenzie, for that. Rick also mentioned, so Florida does have statutes in place for threat assessment teams, and Ohio is in the process. We are establishing threat assessment teams. There's a statute for that. However, we don't have any like a statewide receptacle, and I know Florida is working on that. I don't know Florida if they actually extend past if that statewide receptacle is just like K-12 or if it goes into higher ed or even in adulthood. I don't know if anybody wants to talk about that as far as, and we brought that point up before that, you know, once they leave that school setting, we don't necessarily have eyes on them any longer. So does anybody want to, you know, bring up anything that they have done or work that they've been able to accomplish in keeping tabs on those students that may have moved or matriculated?
That's been a question that we've had posed to us. For example, we're required to share threat assessment information with other school districts, but there's nothing to say that we share it with anyone outside of that. And I think everybody's hesitant. Like if, for example, if we maintain the threat assessment report on a student, does that information follow that student into higher education? And that's a concern I have as well.
And we certainly don't want, you know, a black mark on that student necessarily, but I think it's a situational awareness piece where if a student and going from one high school to another, having that information available to the people that need it. You know, you don't want to blackball a student just because they made one mistake. And if they start over in a new school, that's obviously not something we want to have necessarily follow them. But I think there are certain people that do need to be aware of those kinds of situations as well, Rick. Thank you.
And just to follow up on that, Nicole, earlier in the chat, and I apologize if I'm getting your name wrong. Aisha Lanich said, you know, one thing is establishing good connection or rapport with the student and family members. And we were having that initial conversation about what happens when they leave the school and how do you keep eyes on them. I don't know if Aisha wants to jump on and say a little bit more about that, or if other people have found ways of staying connected or providing that support once a student leaves a school system, if they've, you know, been let go from the school, how to maintain some of that community-based connection or even family-based connection.
And she also mentioned social media monitoring. I'm curious if, so Ohio we do have social media monitoring in our state. Not necessarily we're targeting specific people, but we have keywords that kind of pop up in our school safety center, monitors those sorts of things. So also curious too, if she's not willing to share some more, if anybody else has anything to add to that.
Hi, yes, I'm Aisha. I can share more. I am feeding my son right now, just multitasking, so you may hear him in the background. Just disclaimer there. Yeah, I worked for the University of Iowa doing threat assessment management, and oftentimes we would be involved with conduct processes where a student was suspended or expelled. So I found it very important early on to establish really close connections and rapport with that student, and expressing like sincere compassion for them, and getting connected to outside supports and resources, and showing that you value kind of like their future success as well. That, you know, even though you are leaving the university, or if it's an employee who's terminated, you know, I do work for the university, but my support and help doesn't end there. So making it from like a helping standpoint too, I think is really good. And looping in parents, if students are okay with that early on, has been really helpful to maintain those connections, because, you know, sometimes you might get a student who fades out or stops responding to you, and then you at least have third-party monitors that can reach out to you if a new concern pops up, or if you want to just check in to see how things are going. And then also social media monitoring, that's something that I do with most of my cases, just checking in to see if there's any posts that are concerning, any major behavior changes. We use TweetDeck too to look at maybe threats to the community when we had a lot of demonstrations going on and things of that nature. We would screen around certain events that were happening. as well. So I think those are just key with if you're losing anything you don't have any type of mandatory connection to the student, they're not coming in and going to school, you don't really have eyes on them. You can't say, hey, you have to meet with me at this point. So just some things that I've found to be really helpful.
Thank you for sharing that, and your baby sounds adorable in the background.
Thank you.
And I see Judy just posted in the chat, and just wanted to follow up with your comment, Judy, about being at a large university and getting information ahead of time. I don't know if you or someone in a similar situation wants to share a little bit more about how that information sharing has gone, whether it's been helpful, relevant, inconsistent, late in coming. I'm curious about just the experience of how that information gets to the right people in the right way to actually be useful for the work that you or others in larger universities who are working in this space.
Yeah, I can chime in on that too before maybe someone else wants to. We had a team get together. It was, director of conduct, threat assessment team director, and folks with our police department to screen any applications that came in. Were there any red flags or student disclosed prior significant arrests or convictions? So come to the table and kind of go over that and gather information on the individual and kind of just have a conversation on, should they be admitted on this? What types of supports need to be in place? And then having them on our radar as maybe someone to potentially monitor. Typically, we found that, most students trying to come in were open and honest and seemed to be trying to move forward, and there wasn't really a need to further monitor the situation or work with them. But it was good to know that they were going to be a part of our community and that we could connect them to resources early on. So I did find it to be helpful, and we would at least have them in our system. Just if they would pop up again, we would have more information on their background as well, which was helpful.
Thank you. And yeah, Judy, I saw you unmute yourself. I didn't want to know if you wanted to jump in here as well.
Yeah, I would second that. And, I feel like we get the gamut. And when we get that information up front, whether it's from admissions or the student discloses, it's really valuable for us, because then we can, from the get-go, help support and get them connected with services and supports. But we get the gamut. There are times where we get it in the beginning, and then there are times where it's well after the fact, where we're doing research of, oh, the student's been suspended from 3 other schools, and it would have been really helpful to have that information in the beginning.
Just a quick follow-up, Judy, about this, because one of the questions was really around information sharing, confidentiality, et cetera. So from your experience, who gets this information? How is it managed or utilized? And maybe more importantly, who doesn't get this information?
So I think probably the first point of contact for us who gets this information is a team called our Student Support and Case Management Team, which is out of our Dean of Students office. And they are not clinicians, but they are case managers who their sole purpose is really just to support the students in being successful. And so they can get that information. And while they're covered under FERPA, with any health and safety concerns is when they're allowed to communicate outside of the university, and they communicate. There is no confidentiality for them I'm at the counseling center. And so they don't have confidentiality with us. So they can communicate anything to us. They can communicate to law enforcement, to Res Life. So we have a student of concern team that is our threat assessment team that's made up of the counseling center, the student support and case management department, our police department, Res Life, disability services. And so we meet weekly to discuss these cases. And from the counseling side, our role is primarily consultants But when we have students who get elevated to that more threat or concerning level, one, we try to get a release of information for this team so that we can communicate with the team. Or two, if it raises to a level, then we will document and communicate why we are breaching confidentiality due to potential health and safety concerns to either the individual or to the campus.
Thank you. That's helpful just to see how that process unfolds and some of the controls in place to try to manage the flow of information and who has access to that information. Because I would imagine that would also raise some anxieties potentially, even among the students themselves, wondering who knows what and what impact that might have if information was shared with less rigorous controls. So thank you for sharing that. I want to go back, it looks like in the chat, and this is another reason why I like these symposiums, when people can share resources in the chat with each other. So thank you for being helpful to other people in the meeting. But Bruno, I know you were responding to a comment earlier about the family involvement, family partnership, and how families are engaged in, how they are worked with through the threat assessment process. Could you say a little bit more about, again, the role of family in your work, or some of the ways that you've helped families understand the behavioral threat assessment process, or what's happening, why it's happening, and how do you get them in as collaborative partners as opposed to perhaps scaring them away or making them fearful about what's unfolding?
Sure. Step one is bringing them in early on and really being sincere about the process, and then staying in touch with them throughout the management piece, which I think sometimes it's a piece that's missed. There's communication during the assessment phase, and then you put interventions in place, but you're not updating them. So it's important to maintain the communication. And especially when students move to college or other places, when we're closing our monitoring because they're no longer here, we explain to families that, this is not, the change in behaviors are not necessarily due to a miracle cure. It's because of all of the things that we put in place, which is really important for you to sustain that and share. So here's a list of things that we put together and we were doing, and hopefully you can maintain the strategies that we put in place. Also, we try to gain parental permission if they're seeing a therapist outside of the school environment to get them to communicate with our clinical social workers or our LPCs so that they can maintain two-way communication. And we do the same with them. If the parent has a waiver signed, we will tell the therapist, hey, the student is graduating. Here's a list of things that we are doing on our end to ensure student success. So we just keep them going, and they get, at some point, eventually they'll see that even if they're suspicious about the threat assessment protocols that we have in place, they'll 9 out of 10 times they'll become a partner because they get to see that we mean what we're saying. We want student success. We're not just looking at the threat. We often find common denominators with lack of academic engagement or attendance, which is why we also develop academic plans and attendance plans so that we can ensure student success. And they get to see that. So communication is essential.
Thank you for sharing that. I liked your summary in the chat, Nicole, about transparency and communication. And I think Nikki in the chat makes a good point that, again, because the symposium brings in people from a variety of states and locations, some of what people are talking about may or may not be reflective of what is happening in your particular state or jurisdiction or city, that things can vary greatly around laws, mandates, funding, resources. So we have to sort of understand kind of what's out there, what's possible, and then what's possible given where you're located, and working within the parameters of what's allowed given your particular state or location. Not everything is going to work everywhere. So I'm trying to get caught up on the chat over here. So. Oh, you're on mute, Nicole.
Sorry, my dog was barking before, so I had to mute myself. So Rick has a really good point about the fear of, schools sharing information to K-12 and higher ed or employers because it could affect the person's chances of admission. So as a school counselor, I'm filling out information and referrals when I'm doing recommendations for students. And there are always questions about whether or not I should be sharing much information. So I think that's a good point. I appreciate what Judy said, though. It's a preventative practice rather than stigmatizing the student. I think they're trying to be proactive and support the student rather than keeping them out. Again, I don't think it should be restrictive. So I think those are two really good points.
I want to just follow up with what Zach just put in the chat. Zach, I don't know if you're comfortable sharing, because this public-private partnership, it may just be me, but that's not something that I'm familiar with. I don't know if others are and might want to jump in, or if Zach feels comfortable jumping in. But it sounds like this brings together a wide variety of people. So, oh, there you are, Zach. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, James. So I was a former special agent with the U.S. Border Patrol. I did a lot of counter narcotics, counter human trafficking work out in California, and then things in Mexico. And then I later was a special forces officer in the Army. And did a lot of things with the intelligence community and federal law enforcement. But in the transition from leaving Washington, D.C. behind and moving, I was looking for ways to stay connected. And McCain Institute was one of those avenues that I've gotten connected with some of my former colleagues, things like that. But the FBI has this public-private partnership called InfraGard, and there's national chapters. There's also local regional chapters. And those organizations, for instance, here in the state of Ohio, you get access, once you're approved as a member of InfraGard, you then have access to nearly every state and regional resource to be part of the solution. So whether that's the IC3, which is, I think, the Internet Crime Complaint Center, or the regional fusion centers, working with all the different federal authorities that are within each state. And on a fairly weekly basis, I suppose, or even bi-weekly, there's lots of webinars and events that you can choose to participate in, mostly at no cost to you. And they really do bring a lot of different folks from across disciplines to those webinars and those events to be really solution oriented on how to solve some of these wicked challenges that are out there.
No, thank you, and I appreciate it. It looks like Matthew and Stephen put in the chat some links to the InfraGard. And I'm just wondering, either Zach, while we have you on the screen, or if Matthew or Stephen want to jump in, I'm just curious how people have used this information in their work. Have they found the access to the information informative to some of the work that they're trying to do in their local communities? So I'm curious about how it gets translated into sort of on the ground work.
So I'll give my little snippet here, and I don't want to do a shameless plug for my company, but I joined this firm after having turned in my badge in the CIA 2 years ago, and it was a company that had a technology that I had never seen before, and I'd longed for in a lot of my work across 54 countries around the world. And they have a emotion AI technology that was born of federal funding in a university. So there's over 400 peer-reviewed published articles about the technology, patented, lots of intellectual property based on that. But what it does is it measures emotion from any textual or transcribable data source. And so some of the discussions we were talking about earlier was like, how do you know what happens when a student goes home? Well, most kids today, I know my 3 kids all have devices. And guess what? What's open source, what's publicly available, for a lot of communities, and depending on the legalities, things like that, title authorities, can be seen as fair game. Now, obviously, depending on where you're working, there's rules, left and right limits on what you can pursue and what you can't. But needless to say, when you're working in some sort of law enforcement authority or medical discipline, there's a lot of room for work in that space with regards to this type of data that's already out there. And I put in the comments earlier about privacy laws. We as users of these devices and these apps and all these services, for the most part, give away our rights to a lot of the privacy on these apps and this data. And so I'll never forget when Facebook bought Instagram. I deleted my Instagram account because Instagram said it needed access to my contact list, not just my Facebook or Instagram contacts, but my phone contact list. Why do they need that? Why do they also need access to your emails on your phone? Think about that. And so, not to go down the social dilemma Netflix special, right? But the idea that all this data is out there, and for the most part, users give it away. And so here locally within my business, obviously my business focuses on government clients, the Department of State with disinformation, SOCOM, things like that, with exploiting adversaries in the social media sphere and open source intelligence world. But with the work that we do in our pharma business, our healthcare business, we get HIPAA compliant data between doctors and patients within telemedicine. And we're helping the doctors, work with their patients. We're helping patients understand what the doctors are prescribing or telling them to do. But all of these things are based in emotion because we are human beings. We're not as rational as we hope we would be. And the reality of some of the status quo sentiment analysis tools is they fall short because they're not very predictive. You can't just say tonation and polarity gets you there. You have to think about the context from which you identify and find the idioms of language. And so we apply it every single day because it works across our business units, from the work we do in academia with identifying the right archetype students to go into STEM programs, to doing things like end-to-end talent management with the talent bleed that we're seeing in the Greatest Resignation, where we've created an app that's called the Stay Interview to prohibit or inhibit the exit interview. So I'll let somebody else talk, but really interesting things that I'm glad that we're having this discussion.
Thank you for sharing that. And I was going to ask Matthew or Stephen to jump on if they wanted to talk about their use of that, but I'm also looking at you, Neil, because I apologize. I have not been paying attention to time. So I'm not sure where
You
we
have
are.
10 minutes left.
Okay, thank you.
Looks like Stephen's no longer on the call.
Okay. As we near the end of our time, but I'm just wanting to follow up and see if there are other questions, comments, whether they come from our suggested topics or just further exploring some of the things our participants have shared with us regarding information, working with law enforcement. As Nicole summarized, the issue of communication and transparency, and really, how do we get the information from the people we need to get the information from to put it to best uses to help the people we're trying to help. If other folks want to share some of their thoughts on what they have found useful or barriers to things that they would like to address, that would be certainly things we can entertain here.
I just noticed that we skipped over a comment from Star Butterton. I don't know if she's still on the call, but just reassuring students and families that this is student-centered and it's not meant to be a scary situation when we do threat assessments. It's about supporting students. So I don't know if Star wants to jump in and say anything about that, but I just noticed that we had skipped over that comment. So.
No, I'll say something. I just, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Oh, great. Put my camera on too while I'm doing that. In any case, what I think about, and it's been sort of over time, we've gotten to that point because when we first started with threat assessment in our district, it was pretty scary to families and parents. And then people would want to bring lawyers in and things like that and not want to speak. And so we've tried to really reassure and make sure that's sort of step one when we start having that discussion with families, that this is about supporting your student and keeping people safe, and that we want to work together, and we try and just make sure that we really send that message. It's never easy because it does scare people, but it's not meant to be. So it's been our mission to transform it that way.
Thank you, Star, for sharing that. I saw that in the chat, Brett posted links to some of the read ahead materials developed for the network and some of the trainings. So again, I would encourage you, as again kind of a follow up to the spring symposium, to check out some of those documents that have been put together. I'm probably going to get it wrong, Brett, if you want to jump on our partner organization who's taken the lead with really putting that stuff together.
Yes, so the Institute for Strategic Dialogue does a phenomenal job of putting together the read ahead materials and the practice guides for all of our workshops and symposia. And so I included the two that Jim mentioned earlier in the chat. I'll include a link to the network resources more generally, and welcome everyone to pull any resources they find relevant and valuable from that page, and also the read ahead materials for this workshop and the practice guide that will come out of this workshop. We'll follow up with all participants to make sure they've got access to those.
Thank you, Brett. I'm trying to make sure we've captured everything in the chat, I think, because there's been a lot going on over there.
I just noticed one more, someone jumped back to the question about getting buy-in. Anybody had any methods for successful buy-in of like reporting things and things like that? Does anybody have anything they want to add to that? I know we're running a little close to time.
Yeah, I can speak to that too. So I would often hold presentations for different student organizations on campus, just trying to meet with different groups and just so they could see a face for who is on the threat assessment team and feel more comfortable. And I would also create scenarios where we would walk through those together and say, hey, this is your friend, you know, they're saying this or doing that, what would you do? And this is what we would do with that information if you called us. So they would understand what the information would maybe be used for, that it would be used for good and for supporting their friend versus being overshared or there's no over response. So I found that to be really helpful.
I did something similar in Ohio. I haven't actually presented it because of COVID, but just talking about the see something, say something, and that you're being supportive of your friend, you're not ratting them out, quote unquote. So keeping that sort of that at the forefront of their mind, you're helping someone, you know, instead of telling or tattling.
I just want to flag Ronald's comment that posted in the chat. I think that's a great, takeaway from, this conversation. I mean, everybody in this space is trying to collaborate, share information, work together, with the goal really of helping these individuals, be they, school kids or others, to provide the kind of information and interventions and supports that will help these individuals move forward in their lives. And it's been very helpful to hear some of what people are doing, what's working well, some of the on-the-ground experiences you all have had with some of the information sharing and communication, and even some of the bumps in the road. But I appreciate your summary, Ronald, that the goal of this is to be on the same page, to get to the same solution and end, to really help these individuals move forward in a healthier, better way. So I appreciate the summary statement.
And Nicole and Jim, just a quick time check. We've got 2 minutes left in this conversation if you want to start with wrap up.
All right. Any last minute questions or comments about what we've covered today? I know we've kind of gone in lots of different directions and raised a lot of interesting issues, but I think we have time for maybe one or two additional comments or questions if people want to jump on and share their experience.
And since so much of this topic has focused on the role of integrated and assessment in schools, I want to remind everyone we are continuing the conversation tomorrow with the panel explicitly on integrated assessment and management in schools. So welcome everyone to continue that conversation there.
Well, I imagine we can probably wrap it up, Brett, and people may have gotten themselves maybe an extra minute for a break, or if you want to let people know what the agenda is looking like, take it away.
That's what I'll do. So first, everyone, please join me in thanking Dr. Jim Marley and Nicole Miller for their role in facilitating this conversation and their leadership across all of our network activities. Our next facilitated conversation, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll have a facilitated conversation led by Dr. Heidi Ellis and Dr. Rachel Nielsen. And that will explore terminology and really reconciling language across all of the different types of assessments we do in this field, be they threat assessments, risk assessment, biopsychosocial needs assessment, and how they align with support and how they may or may not increase buy-in across relevant communities. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we will kick off with Heidi and Rachel. Thank you all, and I'll see you soon.